Hey everybody, today we're going to talk about social media and political polarization. So there's been a lot of public attention to this question of whether social media is increasing or decreasing political polarization, the extent to which we can connect each other, both come together around issues like social policies, but also what we think of each other. Is it driving us further apart or is it pushing us together? So this is a question that social scientists have thought about for a really long time. But the field of data science and the kind of hybrid field of computational social science has now created new opportunities for us to study. But let's go way back to the post-war period when social scientists first started thinking about these kinds of questions. Specifically, in this era, people were trying to understand how exposure to propaganda developed during World War II, World War I, might have shaped how people think about different political issues. And so a lot of money was spent, a lot of research was done, and specifically there was a lot of research done on social networks and public opinion. Social scientists set out to figure out how people get their opinions. Where do they come from? Do they come directly from watching the news, or do they kind of trickle across social networks and kind of sprawl out into a large population? Well, this is a tricky thing to study, and originally social scientists would go out and collect large amounts of data, usually interview data, with people discussing political topics, and they'd try to look at the spread of an opinion across a social network. But this research agenda really fizzled out when it became clear that it's really hard to trace people across a social network, right? You have to not only map the social network, but then interview everyone in the social network in order to understand the dynamics of the groupthink that could occur from a social network shaping an individual's opinion. So the idea of a media echo chamber kind of emerged out of this research. An echo chamber was originally a radio technique used to create the illusion of people talking in a big room. But increasingly, it came to describe how our media diets, what type of newspapers, television shows, YouTube channels we watch, come to shape our political opinions. So this research agenda got a lot hotter with the rise of cable news in the 1980s and the 1990s. Before that, a lot of US media was divided up into 3 or 4 big companies. And many people think that those companies were so big that they couldn't afford to piss off either Republicans or Democrats, right? They couldn't be polarizing because their audience included equal numbers of both Republicans and Democrats because they were the only show in town. Now that all started to change when cable news networks, 24 news hour networks, came online in the 1980s. Increasingly, these media companies didn't have to appeal to a large audience, and to the contrary, there were incentives for them to tailor their message to smaller groups of viewers who they could kind of pull off from the mainstream. And so here's where we saw the rise of Fox News, CNN, later MSNBC, and social scientists began to become very worried that being exposed to only one type of view, something we often call selective exposure to information, could shape people's opinions. And lo and behold, as social scientists started to track this and look at, say, what Fox News viewers thought of the invasion of Iraq in 2002 compared to, say, what people who listen to NPR, National Public Radio, think, and they noticed stark differences. Specifically, they noticed things like Fox News viewers were significantly more likely to believe that Saddam Hussein, the deposed dictator from Iraq at the time, had connections to Al-Qaeda, the terrorist organization which had attacked the US on 9/11. And so what we see is, in this case, media diet really seeming to have a direct effect on people's opinions. And the concerns grew deeper when people began to realize that the more you get exposed to one side of a story, the less you can appreciate the other side of the story, and eventually maybe you don't see the other side of the story at all. And so when social media first came online, this question was kind of just starting to be studied. But instead of worrying about how social media might shape this kind of echo chamber effect, we'll get back to that in a minute, most people were thinking about the internet as a net positive. Remember, before this, there were a few small media organizations, And there wasn't a lot of room for people to speak. Not a lot of people could join the public conversation about an issue. And all of a sudden, with social media, right, anyone can join virtually any conversation about anything, anywhere. And not only that, but when they join these conversations, early proponents of the internet argued, they'll have more information at their fingertips than ever before, right? We can enter conversations and deliberate about facts, right? And arrive at the truth, right? And of course, others were not so optimistic. So in the early aughts, Harvard legal theorist Cass Sunstein wrote an influential book called Republic.com, in which he warned that the internet was actually going to allow us to create even stronger echo chambers around ourselves. Not only by choosing even more proactively what we expose ourselves to. Do we click on NPR, or do we click on Breitbart? Do we click on the Wall Street Journal, or do we click on CBS News, right? We can begin to tailor our information diet and control it like never before. And so Sunstein warned that the more that we can personalize our information diet, the worse that this echo chamber effect would become. Now, a few years later, somewhere around 2011, another interesting argument came along. And this was right around the heyday of social media. Social media had, of course, been around for about a decade, but Facebook was really starting to take off. Before it, MySpace and Friendster had been taking off, and people were really starting to think about how social media was going to shape democracy. At the same time, Google had become pervasive. For those of you who are younger, there was once a time when you couldn't just look up whatever you wanted on your phone, right? And so when these two things came together, people began to wonder, how is the way that we're shared information with by these platforms, Google, Facebook, whatever other platforms you use, how is that shaping our views too? And it's one thing if we go there knowing that and intentionally exposing ourselves to one side of the story. But what if something deep inside the algorithms that run these kind of sites and platforms are actually determining what we see without us even knowing? This is where the idea of the filter bubble came from. Internet activist Eli Pariser introduced this idea in a famous book with that title, The Filter Bubble. And so the concern was essentially, not only do we tend to expose ourselves to information that's already congenial or consistent with our worldview, but platforms are seeing us do this. Their algorithms are learning from our behavior and then reinforcing this process at scale, right? And so with this, then we see even bigger concerns about the power of not just the internet, but specifically social media, and specifically a form of machine learning known as deep learning, in which algorithms look for clues of patterns of behavior and then can produce really remarkable predictions about what will happen, but predictions that are not interpretable, meaning that even the people who build these algorithms, when they make a successful prediction, might not know why it's making the prediction. So then the concern became even deeper. Well, if we can't figure out where these algorithms are changing our information diet, how can we ever stop them? How can we even know that they're affecting us, right? And so there was a lot of concern for a long time about filter bubbles. Several years later, some data scientists at Facebook set out to try to tackle this question with a lot of new data. They had created a measure for each Facebook user of whether they lean to the left or the right based on things like what they like and who they're connected to. And also a little bit about what they say in their posts, if I remember correctly. So once they'd done this, they were able to calculate how often a Republican shares a post that is eventually seen by a Democrat. And conversely, how often does a Democrat share a post that is eventually seen by a Republican? Remember, if we're all in filter bubbles, if we're all in echo chambers, it's supposed to make it difficult for those type of information flows to cross paths, right? Republicans are supposed to be friends with other Republicans, share news from Republican sources, and liberals are supposed to be doing the same thing on the other side, right? Well, they crunched a massive data set of a large group of users, and lo and behold, they found that overwhelmingly, people tend to share information with people who already share their view. Now, interestingly, Facebook tried to look into whether the algorithms themselves were driving this, or if the people were driving this. And according to Facebook, it was the people. We'll come back to that issue in a future lecture. Another really interesting study was done of Twitter by the political scientist Pablo Barbera. Barbera set out to look at something similar to what the Facebook data scientist did. He tracked how often the people who retweet a given tweet share the political ideology of the person who made the tweet. He found that a stunning 75% of the people who retweet a given message share the political orientation of the original poster. So both of these studies created really pressing concern that social media had not only increased the echo chamber effect, but had also increased some kind of filter bubble effect, which was more pernicious and potentially more disastrous for democracy. But in a future lecture, we'll see things were a little more complicated than that.